webinar from Pressley Group today. We're going to kick off now, so I will be opening this and running it through the first section, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Mark Johnson. We'll welcome your questions at the end. If you wanted to put them in the chat or wait and talk to us about them later on, then that's fine. Otherwise, we'll get started. So today's webinar is about decommissioning. Let me run through to the agenda. Michelle, can you give me control, please? Okay, so today we'll give you just a quick introduction to who Pressley are. I know some of you know us well, but for others, we'll give a little bit of background. And then we've really got two main sections. I'll talk a bit about the rationale for system decommissioning and why would you want to consider doing it. What's the case for doing a project around decommissioning. And then Mark will go on to talk about how you run a decommissioning project and what are the lessons we've learned, how you structure a project. What are the things to look out for? Then we'll wrap up and we'll have that time for questions at the end. Okay, so to get going, so Pressley Group, so very quickly, so Pressley Group, we are an SAP partner. We're a gold partner and we have a master services agreement. So that means we work with SAP on projects, on consulting, on services. We're also an open text partner. We've been in business for over 20 years, running projects around the world, actually, for over 650 customers now, really across the SAP customer base, including some of the very largest and some medium-sized organizations, as I said, in many different countries. So you can see where we have our major offices. Our expertise is very much around the ILM product that we're going to be talking a bit about today, so information lifecycle management, but also we have good skills in open text and really around archiving, right sizing of systems, and specifically the decommissioning area that we'll be covering in more detail today. We've done a lot of work with customers moving to HANA, as you can see. Also, more recently, customers moving to one of the hyperscalers. So when people are looking to move to Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, then we can help them right-size their systems and avoid a lot of cost there. And what this is all about is partly about significant savings that we save them on each of the different types of journeys, as well as taking out some business risk and really having a more agile infrastructure and well-managed SAP systems. So let's move on. Michelle, can you page down? Okay, so today we're talking about system decommissioning. And I wanted to begin by just giving a little bit of an explanation of what decommissioning is all about. And again, some of you may be very familiar with this, but I know for quite a lot of the organizations we talk to, it's not something that well understood. So to give a little bit of background, decommissioning is about having a strategic approach to retiring legacy applications. Okay, but what's critical here is often these applications are still being used in the organization and still have some data in them that is often critical to the business. So maybe you have to keep it for some legislative reason or just because it's important to the business. But there's some key reasons why you're keeping these legacy applications going. And when we talk about legacy applications here, it's got quite a specific meaning. Usually we mean applications where you've got some replacement application in place. You put something new in place, but the older application, we'll call it the legacy application, is still being kept going because of that data that it contains. So the legacy application in this context still gives value to the business, got important data within it, and it's that type of legacy application we're thinking of. So when we talk about decommissioning, in some ways that's a misleading title almost. I mean, the decommissioning part is an important part of the beginning of a project. And of course, the objective is to get rid of these legacy applications and the infrastructure that they run on. But really, the priority is about the data. Okay? So when you've done the decommissioning, you will want to have access to that data, and you may have that for many years after the systems are decommissioned, and that's going to be your focus for all that time going forward. And clearly, there's important things to think about. We need to make sure that it's possible to extract the data from the legacy system, that you've got somewhere else to store it, and you want that to be something that typically that's modern and more secure, but also easy to access, so that the users that rely on that data can still have access to that data going forward. This is often a chance to look at the infrastructure platform. So you may have had the legacy application running on premise, but you may have a different strategy going forward, and you may want to keep the data in future on premise, but you may want to put it in the cloud, and there's clearly choices here, and that's something else to think about. And critically, reporting is very important. So in the legacy application, you would have had ways to access that data provided by the application. So there may be, in an SAP system, there's a set of transactions that the users are very used to using and are very familiar with, and clearly we're losing that application, and therefore it's important to define what reporting is important going forwards, and make sure that those reports are available or created as part of the project to do the decommissioning exercise. Okay, so as we look at some of the reasons why you'd want to do decommissioning, I think there's really four key areas, and probably the first two are the most important here. And the first is the one that's most often thought of as the obvious and the leading driver, which is about reducing cost. And it may well be that at the moment, given the current issues in the world, that a lot of organizations have additional cost pressures, and some of these projects that weren't seen as such a priority before could now be seen as more important. When you look at a decommissioning project, there's quite a lot of costs to add up. And one thing we can do is do an initial study with you about the TCO case for doing these kind of projects, because there's a lot of variables to think about. But to try and break it down, let's start with the infrastructure. So you are running the legacy application on some systems, probably in your own data center, but not necessarily. There will be servers, there will be storage, there'll be some specific networking there. There may be additional systems that do backup. You can think about high availability, DR. When we start to add it up and think about the fact that for a large application, you may have your production environment as well as all the other environments, test, dev, QA. There can be quite a lot of infrastructure there. Now, typically, if it's a legacy application, that might be getting old, and then you need to think about what's going to have to happen with that. Does it need to be replaced, which is additional cost for the business? If it's getting older, then is it going to be out of support? And we'll talk about that more with when we move on to the risks. So there's all the infrastructure costs to consider. Clearly, there's a set of software-related costs. So usually you're paying maintenance or support costs on the application. That's probably true as well of the operating system and any database. Again, there may be other components there like backup software that all needs to be considered as part of the overall cost case. And finally, we can look at staff costs. Now you may have minimal staff costs to look after some legacy application. Maybe just one person knows about the application and does it at a very much part-time basis. or it may be more significant than that. Again, it's something that only you will know for your own situation, but it's part of the overall picture. Okay. So cost is, as I said, often thought of as the number one driver, but in some circumstances, actually some of the business risks of running legacy applications are equally or maybe even more important. For example, again, if there's older hardware, potentially that's out of support. For example, we quite often hear about customers keeping legacy applications and having them on systems that are turned off and only turned on when needed. Now that may be virtualized hardware, which may be fine, but if it's some older systems, then again, we've seen situations where customers have gone to turn on an older application and it doesn't come back, and there's been some sort of hardware failure, and then are you able to get the parts for that hardware? And we've heard of customers resorting to eBay to go and get the parts they need to get something up and running. And if it's a critical application, maybe it's a legacy application, don't use it very often, but if you really need that data at that time, that's an important risk. Equally, whether it's the hardware or any part of the software, is it still in support? Is the vendor that provides it providing support still? Potentially they may offer you an extended support contract, which is usually quite expensive. Or if you're running out of support, does that give you any concerns from your auditors? If it's an important business application, they may require it to be something that's supported. So again, a significant risk there. And the other area we hear quite a bit about is some older applications are not compliant with some new requirements. So one recent example, GDPR. We've heard of several examples where there's some older application that is not GDPR compliant and proved not to be possible to make it GDPR compliant. So again, that's a significant business risk. There could be other legal or financial requirements that are important to you. So we often see those as the major drivers for doing a decommissioning project, but it's also worth thinking about the opportunity cost. So the staff that are focused on working on the older applications are not working on something that's potentially new and strategic and important for your business. And also there can be environmental benefits from moving off legacy hardware. Every generation of systems is a lot faster, uses less electricity than previous generations. And if your legacy application is running on some old infrastructure and your business has some environmental objectives, then that can be something that's holding you back from progressing those. So if those are some of the reasons or the drivers for thinking about decommissioning, let's think about some typical scenarios where those can arise. And there can be many examples where you've got some legacy applications for different reasons, but some frequently seen examples are these. So any situation where you've got mergers or acquisitions or going the other way where a business is splitting or divesting a division will require a plan around all the IT systems. Typically we see many examples where there's been a merger and they both have their key business applications, whether it's both SAP or an SAP and something else, or whatever it is. But there's going to be some decisions, and typically there will be some data kept in whichever systems you're moving away from that's still important, and then you need a way forward for addressing that. But that's typically more of a planned scenario. Other examples can be if you're implementing some new solution, often a cloud solution. So for example, we see many customers implement success factors for HR, and will want to license that for all the current employees and move all the current employee data into that new success factors implementation. But generally, we'll keep all the records for ex-employees, the legacy data in their legacy HR application, which may well be something like SAP HR on-premise. Right? And there's similar examples in some of the other areas. Often again, when customers are moving to S4HANA, there's different ways, I'm sure you know, of doing the migration, but if it's more of a greenfield approach, there could well be applications left behind when the new system is up and running. So there's lots of different scenarios that can lead to legacy applications. again, scenarios that can lead you to think about how can you decommission. So let's think a bit about the business case. Is there a good cost case for doing decommissioning? And in general, we find it's a very good cost case for doing so. So these are some typical numbers, and again, this is just based on conversations with a number of customers. We've worked on lots of custom projects, as we saw earlier, and your mileage may vary completely. But for example, we often find that something around 15% of an IT budget is spent on legacy applications, and when you think about the size of those budgets, that's quite a significant sum being spent year on year to keep legacy applications in place. If you could reduce that number, then you'd make some significant savings. And just in looking at any specific project, again, the numbers can vary very widely, but we've seen savings up to 80% savings from a well-run decommissioning project. So we've got a very simple model which we've been putting together around just adding up all the different sorts of costs that we talked about. So I've broken it down into a little more detail here, and it's fairly straightforward to add up all the costs of the existing system, to think about what are going to be the costs of decommissioning, the project itself, plus whatever new infrastructure and software you need to manage the data, and then that will show you the savings case. I also put a note here about having a factory approach, which we can talk about a bit more detail later, but often we find that there's a number of systems to decommission. We'd always recommend starting with the most complex, learning the lessons from that, and often that can drive pretty significant savings, which could then fund the next system being done. And if this works out well, which you can do in many cases, essentially you can get each step being funded by the previous one, so it becomes a self-sustaining business case. So that's the key pieces I wanted to cover, just about the why of decommissioning. And Mark, I'll hand over to you now to talk about how it gets done.
Thank you. Well, afternoon, everybody. So I've got a slide here which I've pulled together after having done quite a number of decommissioning projects so far. You'll have to bear with me, I'm not in sales, so this is more of a technical look underneath the hood of how we decommission SAP systems in an SAP landscape. So the first thing that we need to look at is how do we actually plan to actually make this project a success? And one of the key things we need to look at here is what in the SAP landscape are we decommissioning and who's using it? So the idea here is that we take a look at your SAP system that you're going to decommission from two views. The first view is we need a technical view, which is what data is inside the system, how old is that data, etc. The user view, or the second view on the SAP system, is who's still using it, why are they using it, what reports are they running inside the system, and once we've decommissioned the system, how much of this data do they still need access to? Is any of the data redundant? Can you destroy some of this data? How long do you need to the data that remains? How long do you need to keep it within the organization? And what kinds of reports do you need to run? So this is what we call the blueprinting process, and this is a period of analysis, both from a technical. I've got this amount of finance data, for example, in here, and it's spread over this number of years, and this is the volume per year. And more of a user perspective on, well, you've got 40 users that are still going back into the SAP system, and this user is running these reports, and that user is running another kind of report in there, and this is the data they're looking at, for looking back at it, etc. Now, this gives us a good building point then to understand exactly what it is we're decommissioning from the SAP system itself. So if you look at a SAP ECC system, common things that we decommission are finance, controlling, sales distribution documents, materials management, logistics, plant maintenance, production planning. But also we come across instances where we have a lot of unstructured data. So unstructured data would be physical documents that are stored either within the SAP database itself or externally to the SAP system in a content management solution such as OpenText or Easy Software. These documents have a life cycle. They're related back to an entry inside one of the modules, so they could be related to your sales invoice, your packing list. It could be an inbound invoice from a supplier, which is related to a financial transaction or to a material record inside of the SAP system. So the question is, what do we do with the unstructured data? We need to move that across as well as part of the decommissioning process, so we leave nothing behind. We also look at SAP HR data. This is data which is built into input type data, bespoke input types, payroll information, employee self-service information, all of that good stuff that's inside there, so we can decommission all of the SAP HR data out of your HR SAP environment. And then quite often we do SAP CRM systems and SRM, so customer and supplier relationship management solutions. And there, the holistic view on the data is down to tasks, opportunities, appointments, interactions. How do we take this data out? And the same applies. How often does somebody look at it? What's the relevance of the data in terms of how long you need to keep it? And of course, one person's view on the relevance of data could be, well, we never look at that data, why do we need to keep it? Another person's relevance view would be, well, I work in financial audit and control, and I know I have to keep this document for tax purposes for 10 years. And you could have another view on it where you've got somebody that, if you're in a regulated industry such as the pharmaceuticals industry, you could have somebody sitting there saying, well, this is relevant to a drug that we produce, and I have to keep this information for 50 years under FDA rules and regulations. So it's really, really a case of getting all of that information together. So how do you make this a success? Well, as you can imagine, this is it's not a 5-minute task, and it's not just a purely technical task. I think if you can stress one thing here, it's communication. Okay? So you need to start communicating with the business users and owners at this stage at the earliest possible opportunity. Right? If you're in a regulated industry, you need to involve the quality, regulatory, compliance teams so that they understand what you're about to do with the data and are on board with this, and will help you through that process, rather than all of a sudden becoming a brick wall that you run up against when you've done all the technical work and then you find that they're not going to let you go ahead and do this. Legal need to be involved in case of, if you've got court cases which are running, which are dependent upon the data that's in the legacy systems. They will have a stake and an interest in this, and they will want to ensure that the data is maintained and run out across the and its lifespan, so that if they need to get back at it, it can be retrieved. But also, just as importantly, if they need to ensure that the data is destroyed after a certain point to meet GDPR regulations, etc. So this all breaks down to workshops, which need to take place with each of the stakeholders, the parties involved with it, including the IT team, which has to be able to spin up the hardware necessary for you to decommission the data into. And then finally, from a user perspective, you need to align the user's expectations on how they will now be able to access this data in the new world. Okay. So you could have a scenario where some data is never looked at on a day-to-day basis and is only kept for audit purposes, or should there be a problem, in which case don't really need to worry about the reporting so much. You could have other data that's used daily in your legacy system, and you need to consider how you're going to make that data accessible to the community once you've decommissioned the system. So let's talk about how we're technically going to decommission something. Well, decommissioning process uses a technology from SAP called Information Lifecycle Management Retention Warehouse. And what ILM Retention Warehouse does is it enables you to plug in either a legacy SAP system or even a legacy non-SAP system, extract the data from the legacy system and store it physically within its storage system. So the ILM Retention Warehouse will be connected to an ILM store, which is typically a SAP IQ system where the data is stored, or an open text system. As long as it's a WebDAV compliant storage device, that's where it will store it. And then from a reporting side of things, you'll have local reporting, which is basically like a version of SE16, which enables you to look at the data, and then reporting tools such as SAP BW, SAP HANA reporting, business objects, etc. We can sit on top of this and enable you to report it, report on the data. How do we decommission? Well, as I said before, we're connecting directly into the legacy system, and we use a piece of technology that comes from SAP Landscape Transformation called the LT Extractor. So what this basically does is enable you to, on a table for table basis, take a temporary copy of data that you're decommissioning out of the legacy system that you're extracted the data from. It holds a temporary copy on the retention warehouse environment and enables you then to run the ILM legacy extraction workbench, which basically enables you to take SAP standard archiving objects and run those archiving objects to decommission the data from the temporary tables that you've created. The retention management engine from ILM enables you to add audit areas and rules to the data. And this is quite important because the data that you're decommissioning presumably still has a life cycle. And at some point, you'll want to actually have that data finally destroyed and taken out of your organization. This will ultimately reduce the volume of data that you're sitting inside your retention management system, inside your retention warehouse. So the data is taken and it's technically compressed into individual ADK files, which are stored in compliance database storage area. So it's no longer sitting in database tables as it was in your legacy system. It's now been extracted and stored in effectively archive files inside your ILM retention warehouse. The same happens to any unstructured data, so documents which are sitting associated with the data that sits in this environment. They get copied across. They are stored as well on the ILM compliance storage, and they are linked back, the link remains back to the original object so that you can still see them. So in terms of how we decommission an SAP system, this is a quick view of the workspace for ILM retention warehouse, where it takes you through the different functional areas that you can do. So you can do the transfer of data from the legacy system into the decommissioning area using SLT. You can configure audit areas for the data that you're decommissioning. So you would set up an audit area, for example, for finance data, an audit area for materials management data, a separate one for HR, etc. And then within each audit area, you can set up ILM policies, which enable you to say that, how long do we keep this data for, and what happens to it when we reach the end of life of that data, so that we can have a final destruction process. We then have the audit package set up, which enables us to set up the audit package for being able to run a report. So the audit package would be a package of reports that would be available to the user to report on data that's been decommissioned. And that audit package would have a high-level selection process on it, which would say which year are you reporting on, or which number of years are you, or year range are you reporting on, and then physically at a report level you have the reports that you're running there. So if it's a BW report, it will be mapped to this so that it will push the required data out of the retention warehouse up into BW so that you can report on it. If it was a business objects report or a HANA reporting report, it would do much the same. Finally, down here we have the data destruction, which enables you to either automate or physically go in as a manual process to destroy data once it's reached or past its retention time. And then we have a legal case management component, which enables us to set legal holds on data which is being particularly used by the legal team for fighting legal cases. So here's a few screens on setting up the transfer of data from the legacy system to the staging area. It's all done with inside your SAP system, where we can see the source and the destination, and see that we've got green light saying that we've extracted, created the extraction areas. You then have the ability to control the process of running the extraction, and then that has extracted the data out, and it's sitting in your ADK files. So it's an end-to-end process. Do not underestimate the amount of time it can take to actually extract this data out of your legacy system, move it across into the temporary storage area using SLT, and then running the individual archiving objects. This process with a large database in the terabyte size can take months to actually physically do the decommissioning work. We're not talking about the setup time, we're talking about the physical processing time to actually physically decommission large volumes of data. It can be quite time consuming. A little bit on reporting. As I said before, reporting is driven by having a audit package of data, or an area where we're auditing the legacy data, and this then has a number of reports, and the reports can be of different types. So the simplest report type would be based on SAP query. So anybody that's used SQBI inside an ECC system would be familiar with this, and you can build by painting your report. You can also write ABAP reports directly. Then you have things like business objects for SAP reporting, SAP HANA reporting, and SAP BW reporting. Obviously, there's a sliding scale of complexity and cost of actually creating the reports in there. Over to you. Robert,
thank you, Mark. I'm on, yes, thank you. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about some examples of some projects that we've run. So 3 today. So the first is Maple Leaf Foods, major food company based in Canada. They were going through one of the scenarios I described earlier, where they were divesting a division, and as part of that, they had a number of SAP systems to decommission, and we had to extract the data from those, which was in over 88 terabytes of data. So a fairly significant piece of work now to be done there. We did that, enabled those systems to be decommissioned, and therefore there were significant savings from that. Plus, they had obviously requirements to to delete all that data as it was no longer relevant to the core Maple Leaf business going forward. So that's a very good example. We partnered there with Synity, also known as Back Office Associates, that we work with very well. And in fact, you can look on their website for a full write-up of that case. Another couple, the major pharmaceutical company was in the UK. I think that's one of the largest decommissioning projects been done within the SAP world. We started off doing 10 large SAP systems, but they also had a number of non-SAP systems that they wanted to decommission, and we've done 55 JD Edwards systems with the same SAP ILM technology, and there's more work going on there still. So a very major project. We helped them set up a factory approach, which is working very well for them. And we're recently doing a piece of work with one of the major UK high street banks, again, decommissioning a number of SAP systems, in this case some ECC and some SRM systems using the same ILM technology. So that's the key things we wanted to cover. I will just move on to the last chart. So in terms of next steps, typically we're very happy to have an initial discussion with any organizations interested in doing this sort of project. Whether you want to work initially with SAP and get some sort of briefing, but we can equally give a good briefing on the ILM product in a lot more detail than we've covered today. We can go into more detail on what a project looks like, and what the typical stages are, what sort of time frame you need to think about, and then you've got the choice to run that project yourselves or ask us to help with that. And in many cases, people want to start with a discovery phase or a scoping exercise, which really is needed to look in detail at your current environment and what the requirements are, and then the whole project can be properly scoped. Or any of these other approaches where you might want to look at some work on the business case first of all. You might want to look at doing a proof of concept, or a proof of concept where we take some specific area like finance from one system, or more of a full pilot where we look at a full system to decommission first as a major proof point that the approach works, and then we will go on to do others with you. So there's a whole variety of ways to go forward, and we're very happy to talk about this. If you wanted to invite us to speak to a wider set of people or different people in your organization, and talk through all of these areas and give the benefits of our experience. Very happy to take some questions now. Michelle, over to you if we had any questions in yet.
Yes, we've got a couple. So the first one is, on average, or what is the average project time for decommissioning the first system?
And Mark, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so, well, it does kind of depend on the size of the system that you're decommissioning, and also the complexity. The last couple of decommissioning projects we've done have been an end-to-end project between 4 to 6 months. But if you look at what we were doing for the pharmaceutical world, that was years of work to decommission the data. So it really does depend on the volume of data and complexity of the reporting that you want to do on it afterwards. That makes a difference. The infrastructure can be set up, and you can build the solution in about 2 months. But then you're into having to actually do the decommissioning work itself, and it becomes a bit like a factory if you've got multiple systems to do as well. But a system itself, start to finish, minimum 4 months to 6 for an average size SAP system.
Thank you, Mark. What are the license implications with SAP once you've moved the data to ILM?
I'll take that. So ILM is a product you would need to license from SAP. there's some different versions of ILM. So there was a version brought out a couple of years ago specifically to address GDPR requirements, which is a different use case. And there's a free version to do that. But again, that's limited really to management of personal information around GDPR type scenarios. So as soon as you want to do full archiving or decommissioning of systems, you'd want the full product. ILM is licensed by the number of systems you're managing or decommissioning. So again, I'd say, talk to the contacts you have at SAP about any real details, further details of licensing. It's worth understanding a couple of things within the ILM license now. There's one license that covers all different scenarios. So it used to be the case a few years ago that you had to have different licenses for decommissioning or for archiving. Now one license covers all of those. You just need to have it for the number of systems being managed. And also now the license includes a license for two things. One is the SLT software that Mark mentioned is critical for extracting data in especially in decommissioning scenarios. And it also includes a license for the IQ database. So we find many organizations choose to use that as the store for the extracted data. There are other choices. You can store the data in SAP HANA, you can store the data in Hadoop. There's a number of different choices actually, but given that IQ is included and is actually a very high performance database, offers a lot of compression, we find that's the choice for many.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Michelle.
And finally, one more. How does the data look once the legacy data is archived? How is it viewable?
Mark, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, it depends on what reporting you want to use for this. And whether you want to report the data in BW, then it will look like a BW report. If you want to report it on a business logic report, it looks like a BO report. If you're using an ABAP report, it can look very similar to an ABAP report does. One of the things that we do a lot for our customers is where they have big reporting needs, we do custom reports which enable you to report from it within inside your new SAP system. So the way that works is if you've got a requirement for seeing the legacy data alongside the active data in your new SAP system, we can stage that data in its own separate data area and then report on that from within your consume the data from that database within inside your new SAP system. So it's, for example, we would stage that data in the HANA database pendant to your existing ECC application, and then that report would span both data sets if necessary, or just bring data in from the legacy data. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, that's great. Okay, if there's no more questions now, you can do a last minute one if you like. We have a few more minutes. If not, then we will send you the recording and the slides for your perusal and pass on to your colleagues. And stay safe. And thank you for attending. Goodbye.